Nobody warned me that the wedding was not the finish line. I had spent 38 years in banking, and I understood contracts and obligations and the difference between what is agreed and what is expected, and still nobody warned me. Perhaps they assumed I knew. Perhaps they assumed that a 71-year-old man who had navigated the city of London for 4 decades would understand that in certain family cultures, a marriage is not a two-person arrangement, it is an adoption. You do not marry a woman. You marry everyone she has ever been responsible for, and everyone who has ever had a claim on her, and everyone who calculates that your arrival represents an opportunity that may not come again. I did not know that. I know it now. It cost me £420,000 to learn it, and I am still not entirely sure the lesson has finished arriving. My name is Quincy Mansfield, 71 years old. I spent my career in corporate banking in London 38 years, the last 12 as a senior director at a firm whose name I will not use here because the story I am about to tell is mine and not theirs. I retired in 2019 with a pension and savings sufficient for a comfortable life and a clear plan to spend the years ahead doing what a long career had prevented, reading, traveling, and inhabiting my days at a pace that did not require a calendar alarm. My wife, Margaret, my first wife, had passed in 2017 after a long illness, and I had spent 2 years working through that loss quietly before retiring into the smaller, more deliberate life that I thought was waiting for me. I went to Cebu for the first time in the autumn of 2020. A former colleague named Stuart had retired there 2 years earlier with his Filipina wife, and he had written to me an actual letter, which is how Stuart communicates when he wants to say something properly, describing the city with the careful enthusiasm of a man who has found something good and wants to share it without overselling it. I went for 3 weeks. I came back 6 months later for 6 weeks. By early 2021, I had made a decision that surprised everyone who knew me. I was going to base myself in Cebu for the foreseeable future, keeping my London flat but spending the majority of my time in the Philippines. The cost of living suited my pension. The climate suited my joints. The pace suited what I had decided I needed. I met Francine Gutierrez at an event planning expo in Cebu City in March of 2021. This requires a small explanation. Stuart's wife had become friendly with a group of local event professionals and had invited me along to what she described as a trade exhibition for wedding and corporate planners, the kind of event she attended for professional reasons, and that she thought I might find interesting as a window into how local business operated. I went because I had nothing particular scheduled and because I had learned in the first months of my Cebu life that saying yes to things I had no reason to decline was how I discovered what the place actually was. Francine was one of the exhibitors. She ran a wedding planning business, Gutierrez Events, and her stand was organized with a precision and visual clarity that I noticed because I have always noticed how people present their work. Everything was where it should be. Nothing was excessive. She spoke with potential clients in the direct, unhurried way of a professional who is confident in the quality of what she offers and does not need to oversell it. I watched her for a few minutes before Stuart's wife introduced us, and in those few minutes I formed the impression of a person who was serious about her craft. That impression did not change when we talked. She asked what had brought me to the Philippines, listened to the answer without hurrying toward her own reply, and told me she had been running her business in Cebu for 11 years. She was 43 years old, and she had the self-possessed quality of someone who had built something from nothing and knew the difference between what that required and what merely looked like it required the same thing. We had coffee 3 days later, then dinner the following week, then a walk along the waterfront the week after that. The progression was natural and unhurried, which suited me because I am by temperament a careful person and I do not move toward things quickly when I have the option to move slowly. By June we were seeing each other regularly, and by September I had admitted to Stuart, not to myself yet, but to Stuart, that I was genuinely happy in a way I had not been in several years. He was pleased for me and said so, and then said, with the careful phrasing of a man who wants to say something without causing offense, that I should take my time and be sure of what I was getting into before I made any large decisions. I told him I was always careful. He said he knew that, and that careful was sometimes not the same as thorough when the heart was involved. I should have pressed him on what he meant. I did not. I filed it as the general caution of a friend who cared about me and moved on, which is, I have come to understand, almost exactly the same mistake Blake Richardson made with Owen Carr, and which I had the particular advantage of having read nothing about, because I am not the kind of man who reads accounts of other men's misfortunes as cautionary material. I should start. Francine and I became engaged in February of 2022. I proposed carefully and deliberately, the way I do everything, after almost a year of knowing her and several months of understanding that I wanted to marry her. She said yes, with a warmth that was genuine and a practicality that I found attractive. She began talking about logistics within the same conversation, not out of unromantic haste, but because she was a wedding planner and logistics were how she expressed care for things that mattered to her. I found that charming. It was charming. The wedding was in September of 2022. Francine planned it herself, which was a natural thing for a professional wedding planner to do and which produced a ceremony and reception of considerable beauty that I was genuinely proud to have been part of. The total cost was £85,000. I paid it without complaint because I had agreed to it and because the number was not unreasonable for a wedding of that scope in that context and because I was marrying a woman I loved and the money was available. Francine was meticulous about every detail and the day was, by every measure I had available, exactly what a wedding should be. I flew her mother and 2 sisters up from their home province for the ceremony. I paid for their accommodation and travel without being asked. I considered it a normal extension of hospitality. I note that now because of what came 12 days later. 12 days after the wedding, Francine's mother, a woman named Estrella, whom I had met 4 times and who had been warm and grateful at the ceremony, came to our apartment in Cebu City and asked to speak with me privately. Francine was at a client meeting. Estrella sat across from me in my own living room with the composed expression of a woman who had rehearsed what she was about to say. She said that now that I was properly part of the family, there were some family matters she wanted to discuss with me. She said she hoped I would understand that Filipino families are close and that the responsibility of family was shared between all members. She said she had made a list. The list was handwritten on 3 pages of a small notebook. She talked me through it item by item. Her late husband's business had failed 8 years earlier and left debts of approximately £95,000 that had been hanging over the family since his death. Creditors who were becoming difficult, she said, and who represented a source of ongoing shame and stress for everyone. Her own mother, Francine's grandmother, had received inadequate medical treatment years earlier due to financial constraints and had ongoing health needs that required funding approximately £75,000 by her estimate. There was a property boundary dispute in the province that had been unresolved for years and would require legal fees and settlement payments of around £85,000 to finally close. And there were investment needs land, she said, and a small commercial property that would secure the family's financial future and which would require approximately £100,000 to pursue properly. I listened to all of it. I did not say yes or no in that meeting. I said I would need to think about it and discuss it with Francine. Estrella said she understood and that she was grateful for my patience, and she left the list with me. I sat with it for an hour before Francine came home. When she did, I showed it to her and asked her what she knew about it. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "My mother has been carrying these things for a long time." I said that did not answer my question. She said, "I know about them. They are real. I did not want to tell you before the wedding because I did not want it to feel like a transaction." I sat with that answer for a long time that evening. It was honest, in its way. It was also the moment when I should have understood something fundamental about the situation I was in, and I did not understand it because I was 12 days married to a woman I loved, and the understanding would have required me to consider a possibility I was not ready to consider. I gave Estrella £95,000 over 3 months for the business debts. This was my first post-wedding transfer to the family, and I made it having convinced myself of several things: that the debts were real, that clearing them was a reasonable contribution to the family I had married into, that Francine's obvious relief when I agreed was evidence that the need was genuine, and that a man of my means had no real basis for refusing an amount that was, in the context of my overall financial position, significant but manageable. I did not verify the debts independently. I told myself verification would be insulting, which is the kind of logic that sounds like decency and functions like blindness. Over the following 8 months, I paid the medical costs for the grandmother £75,000 in installments to accounts Estrella specified, and the legal and settlement costs for the property dispute £85,000, of which £40,000 went in a single transfer, when Francine told me the case had reached a critical point and delay would result in losing the settlement window entirely. I asked for documentation on the property case and received a document that I later had reviewed by a Cebu attorney who told me it was a real document from a real case, but that the settlement figure it referenced was substantially lower than what I had transferred. When I raised this with Francine, she said the additional amount had covered legal fees and facilitation costs that were not reflected in the formal settlement record. I accepted that explanation and told myself that the Philippine legal system operated differently from what I was accustomed to and that the discrepancy likely had an innocent explanation. It may have. I do not know. I have stopped trying to determine the proportion of what I gave that went where it was said to go, because the accounting is less important now than understanding the overall shape of what happened. The investment transfer, the £100,000 for land and commercial property, was the one I resisted longest. By the time Estrella raised it formally, in the spring of 2023, I had been married for 7 months and had already given the family £255,000, and I was beginning to feel something that I did not have clean language for. It was not suspicion exactly. It was the low-grade discomfort of a man who senses that the terms of an arrangement are not what he understood them to be when he agreed to them. I told Estrella I needed more time. She said she understood. 3 days later, Francine brought it up at dinner, not aggressively, but with a seriousness that I had not seen from her before. She said the land opportunity had a time pressure, that her brother had identified the parcel and that other buyers were interested. She said she knew I had already given a great deal and that she was aware of how much she was asking, but that this was the investment that would make the family stable going forward and that after this there would be no more requests. I transferred £100,000 the following week. The assurance that there would be no more requests was the thing that made me do it. Not because I was naive enough to believe it absolutely, but because hearing it said directly gave me something I could hold on to, a defined end to an arrangement that had no natural conclusion otherwise. Francine said it, and I chose to believe she meant it, because the alternative was believing something about my marriage that I was not ready to believe 9 months into it. There were more requests. By the end of 2023, I had given an additional £65,000 across what I can only describe as a continuous flow of smaller urgencies: a sibling's medical situation, a flooding event at the family home that required repairs, school fees for a nephew, a business license renewal for a cousin's small enterprise. None of these individually would have alarmed me. In combination, and in the context of everything that had preceded them, they produced in me a feeling that I can describe accurately only as exhaustion, not anger, not yet exhaustion. The feeling of a man who has been meeting demands at a pace that does not allow for the breath between them that would let him see what he is actually doing. I told Francine in January of 2024 that I was not going to continue. I did not say it with drama. I said it the way I say difficult things in banking, factually, clearly, without unnecessary softening but without cruelty. I said I had given what I estimated was £420,000 to her family over the previous 14 months, and that I was not able to continue doing so. I said I needed us to agree, together, that the family financial support was finished and that our marriage going forward would be organized around our own household rather than around the ongoing needs of her extended family. I said I was not angry and I was not threatening anything. I was simply stating a position. Francine looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You don't love my family." I said that was not what I had said. She said, "It's what you mean. In our culture, refusing to support the family is refusing to love them." I said I had supported the family to an extent that most people would consider extraordinary and that I did not believe love was measured in pounds transferred. She said, "You knew who I was when you married me. You knew my family was my responsibility. I said I had not known the specific financial structure of that responsibility when I married her, which was true. She said, I told you before the wedding. I said she had told me 12 days after the wedding, which was also true, and the distinction between those two timelines mattered. She did not respond to that. She left the room, and the apartment went quiet in the way that it goes quiet when something has shifted and neither person is yet ready to name what it is. The weeks that followed were the coldest of my marriage. Francine was not cruel. She was simply absent in the emotional sense present in the apartment, performing the routine of cohabitation, but gone from the warmth that had been the quality I valued most about being with her. She did not argue or press me directly. She conducted herself with a dignified sadness that communicated, without words, that I had failed her in some fundamental way. I recognized the technique not because she was performing it deliberately, I believe, but because I had 38 years of experience watching people use silence and disappointment as negotiating tools, and the shape of it was familiar even when the application was personal rather than professional. I called Stuart. He came over and I told him the full accounting, the amounts, the timeline, the current state of the marriage. He was quiet through all of it, the way he was quiet when he wrote his letter about Cebu, taking the information in before he responded to it. When I finished, he said, Quincy, do you remember what I said to you when you told me you were getting engaged? I said I remembered he had told me to take my time and be thorough. He said, do you know what I was trying to tell you that I didn't know how to say? I said I had not known at the time, and that I had some ideas now. He said, the family financial expectation in these situations is not a hidden thing. It's a known pattern. I should have explained it to you directly instead of around it. I told him that, even if he had, I did not know whether I would have heard it. He said, probably not. But I should have tried harder. We sat for a while after that without talking. Two retired Englishmen in a Cebu apartment who had both handled the same situation differently and arrived at different places. I consulted a Philippine family law attorney in February of 2024. Not to initiate divorce proceedings, I was not at that point yet, but to understand my legal position. The attorney, a careful woman named Rosario who came recommended through the British consulate's assistance list, reviewed what I described and told me several things I needed to hear clearly. She said that in Philippine law, gifts made to a spouse's family during marriage are generally not recoverable, as they are treated as voluntary transfers made without expectation of return. She said the property dispute settlement documentation issues I had described were concerning but would require significant evidence to form the basis of a legal claim. She said my options within the marriage were essentially limited to negotiating a mutual understanding with Francine about future financial arrangements, and my options outside the marriage were available but complex and slow. She said, without editorializing, Mr. Mansfield, I want to make sure you have an accurate picture of what the legal process can and cannot do for you here. What the legal process cannot do is give me back 14 months of a marriage that was working before the exhaustion set in ways that I had genuinely valued. I want to be honest about that because it would be easier to describe Francine as simply a financial predator and the marriage as simply a mechanism for extraction, and that would not be fully accurate. The year we spent together before the demands became the dominant feature of the marriage was real. The warmth was real. Her professional capability was real. The care she showed for the people around her, including me, in the earlier months was not performance. What she also had was a family structure with serious financial needs and a cultural framework in which a husband with resources was expected to address those needs, and she had not been transparent about the scope of that expectation before I agreed to be her husband. Whether that constitutes a fundamental deception or simply a failure of communication across a significant cultural gap is a question I have not been able to answer cleanly, and I have stopped expecting to. I'm still married. I want to say that plainly, because it is where the story currently sits and it would be dishonest to imply otherwise. Francine and I are in a state that I would describe as negotiated coexistence. We live together, we are civil, we attend events together, and we have had 3 direct conversations about the financial arrangement in the past 4 months that have not produced a resolution, but have produced a clearer mutual understanding of where each of us stands. She has not asked me for money since January. I do not know whether that is because she has accepted my position or because she is waiting for the coldness to soften me. I am watching for both possibilities with the attention that 38 years of risk assessment teaches you to bring to situations where the signals are ambiguous. Natalie, my daughter from my first marriage, who lives in Edinburgh, called me in March after I finally told her what had been happening. She did not respond the way I had expected. I had expected the practical concern of a daughter who works in finance and evaluates situations structurally. What I got instead was a long silence and then, "Dad, are you lonely?" I said that was not the issue. She said, "I think it might be part of it." We talked for an hour and it was one of the more honest conversations I have had with her in years. She did not tell me what to do. She said she was concerned and that she was available and that she loved me, and she said it without the overlay of judgment that I had been bracing for. I am grateful for that. I have spent a good deal of time thinking about what I knew and when I knew it and whether, knowing what I know now, I would have made different choices. The honest answer is that I do not know. Not because the answer is complicated, but because I understand myself well enough to know that the appeal of Francine was real, that the happiness of the period before the demands became the context of everything was real, and that real happiness is not something a careful man necessarily steps away from because he cannot fully verify all of its terms. I was 70 years old when I married her. I had been a widower for 5 years. The life I had constructed in Cebu was better than the life I had been living in London, and she was a significant reason for that, and none of that was false. What was also true is that I walked into a marriage with incomplete information about what the marriage entailed financially, that I responded to that incomplete information by giving money rather than by seeking clarity, and that the aggregate of those responses has cost me £420,000 and placed me in a marriage whose future I cannot currently see clearly. Both things are true simultaneously. The happiness was real and the loss is real, and I am living inside both of them without the resolution that would let me organize them into a story with a clean conclusion. What I can say is this: if you are a man of means considering marriage in the Philippines, or anywhere else where family financial obligation is a structural part of the cultural arrangement, you must have a direct, explicit, pre-marriage conversation about what those obligations look like in practice. Not in general terms, in specific ones. Numbers, timelines, family members, the nature of the requests, and the limit of your willingness to meet them. That conversation is uncomfortable. It is also the most important financial conversation you will have in the context of that marriage, and having it before the ceremony rather than 12 days after it will cost you nothing except the discomfort of a difficult discussion. The alternative, which is to assume that love and goodwill will produce a mutually acceptable arrangement without one, costs considerably more. I know that now. I will carry it from here, wherever here leads.